Today, however, we're going to look rather at the historical and theological background of these churches, and I'll make comments on their pertinence for the liturgy as we go along. Hopefully we're all clear by now that there are four families of Eastern churches, right? The Assyrian Church of the East, also called the Ancient Church of the East. They have had some schisms within the church. Actually, I'm not certain right now what the current state is. It was reconciled. I think they were reconciled and that may have opened up again. The Assyrian Church of the East, or Ancient Church of the East, the Oriental Orthodox churches, Eastern Orthodox churches, and Eastern Catholic churches. I mentioned yesterday that these between them represent between 5 and 7, depending on how you count, streams of apostolic Christianity. We can, for various reasons, and this will become clear as you go through the individual traditions, we can group the Coptic and Ethiopian together. That's how we get the Alexandrian, and we can include the Maronite with the West Syrian. But if we have a more expansive list, then we'll distinguish those. And so just so you should know, depending on the literature you're reading, you'll find it. What is confusing, admittedly, is sometimes people seem to think that there's a Ukrainian Byzantine tradition. It's true only in the sense that there is a distinctive chant and popular devotions and so forth, but the liturgy itself, both the divine liturgy and the text of the sacraments and the liturgy of the hours and all the blessings, there's 95% overlap with, if not more, with all other Byzantine churches. And so although people in the past would have spoken about the Ukrainian Byzantine Rite versus the Ruthenian Byzantine Rite or the Melkite Byzantine Rite, that was rather a way of denoting the different churches that use the Byzantine Rite that are part of the Catholic Church. It's not helpful to think of those as distinct rites in the way that we're speaking about them now, because of the fact it isn't more or less the same tradition. Now, these Eastern churches, they, as we said yesterday, are distinct from one another while sharing features vis-a-vis Western forms of Christianity. We enumerated a number of those yesterday. It's important that you understand that rite is not simply ritual, right? Rite includes, and I mentioned yesterday, the Second Vatican Council enumerating theology, liturgy, spirituality, and canon law. Spiritual heritage, sometimes is used, that term is used too. This is in the texts Orientalim Ecclesiatum and also in Lumen Gentium, and don't remember if in Gaudium et Spes as well. I think just in Lumen Gentium and in the Sacrosanctum Concilium and in Orientalium Ecclesiatum. So those four categories, theology, liturgy, spirituality, and canon law, or liturgy or worship, we could add maybe others. You could add ascetical practice, right? Monastic life. These are things that would be expressions of the spirituality. But it's important to at least grasp those four criteria, because it helps us appreciate that worship shapes all of life. You don't just have if you have a distinct form of worship, it will be because it both describes and prescribes a way of being, all right? A way of Christian life. The liturgy is sort of a testament to, it's a sediment of, sedimentation of a distinctive form of Christian experience, culturally conditioned, and it also prescribes, it doesn't just describe, but it also prescribes how the people who use it, who dwell within that tradition, will inhabit the world, right? If you've done any study in ritual theory, Catherine Bell, for example, a ritual theory, ritual practice, or you've looked at Clifford Geertz, people in anthropology, this kind of thing, you'll understand that ritual has increasingly been understood over the latter part of the 19th as well, but 20th and 21st centuries, as not something extrinsic to people, but it's really their way of being in the world. And therefore, it's a fully orbed phenomenon when it's understood properly. Now, you might immediately respond and say, well, for lots of people, ritual doesn't function that way. It's just sort of one thing they do alongside many other things. That may be true, but that just shows the extent to which people have become alienated from their ritual tradition and perhaps adopted other rituals as their formative rituals, the rituals of sport or of entertainment or of work, all of which, the workplace, all of which, you know, have their own ritual. So we want to see these rites that we'll be speaking of as very dense, as kind of saturated phenomena that affect, in principle, every aspect of how people approach their faith. John Paul II in Orientale Lumen that I spoke of yesterday said that this genuine plurality remains the church's ideal. And this is very important for a pope to say this, because he's not the first to say something like this. Leo XIII in Orientalium Dignitas, 1894, I think that was, also spoke about the uniqueness and dignity of the Eastern traditions and the obligation of the Roman pontiff to help preserve them. But by and large, being in communion with the Catholic Church, the Eastern Catholic churches have tended to suffer, yesterday, as I explained, from a process of Latinization. And people on the ground have not always appreciated that plurality is not necessarily a problem, but is actually an advantage, right? That in fact, to have one form of worship that everyone uses is to not only be unfaithful to the history of the church, but is to miss the gift of particularity that comes through enculturation, right? That has always been a Christian way, that is to translate and to make incarnate, right, the faith into a specific context. And the tension arises because once these rites have crystallized, it's not clear how much more they can develop or change without either departing from their historic forms or else converging with something else, right? Just like languages, the overall number of languages in the world is decreasing, not increasing, right? And so some people feel it's important to fight for the preservation of a certain language, but if there aren't people who are speaking it, it becomes a very difficult thing to do. And if there are people speaking it, chances are that it will change. They will bring in new vocabulary, new phrases. They will forget things. They will stop reciting poems or singing songs, and over time it would be not even recognizable to former speakers of the language. So if we use that linguistic metaphor with respect to rite, we can grasp some of the tension, intrinsic tension here in thinking about unity and diversity and the way in which, as these traditions have developed in time, they have proliferated. And there's been this movement towards a diversification, also then a pulling back from that in an attempt to consolidate and strengthen, strengthen the homogeneity within a particular place. So when we see, for example, the 17th century, and goes on past that, debates in the Russian Orthodox Church with the old believers, where the kind of differences that people were quarreling over seemed to an outsider to be really quite not petty, but quite maybe trivial. Their passions felt very deep on both sides. Is people felt on the one hand, by changing, they were going to be losing their faith that they had received. That would be the point of view of the old believers. By changing, for example, from the sign of the cross like this to the sign of the cross like this, yes? On the part of the Patriarch Nikon and the ones who wanted to implement his reform, to not change, that is to not catch up with what contemporary Greek practice was doing, was to somehow be out of sync with the rest of Orthodoxy, and therefore to become backward or primitive or marginalized or what have you. So tension on both sides of about how to preserve. Either preservation happens through change, right? You preserve it by using it and by changing it and adapting it, or do you preserve it precisely by preserving it? In other words, by still using it and not changing it. If one could speak this diagram happens to be that of the Catholic Church, but it is useful conceptualizing the relationship of traditions, even the Orthodox portions that are obviously not in communion with one another. So we have the Latin tradition over here, and I hope you're familiar with that. And this is actually quite up to date because it has the Anglican use, or the Ordinariate, even has a Zairian use. If you didn't realize there was one, there is. It's actually the Roman Missal for the Diocese of Zaire, and it has a number of differences from the ordinary form. In other words, it's part of the Novus Ordo, but it's distinctive enculturation that they had permission to make, to adapt it for use in Africa. And in fact, it's back in North America, because where there are communities of Congolese, they will use they have churches where they have this Zairian use. So we'll put that aside for today, though, because we're not interested in this course so much in those in the Western rites. We have the Byzantine tradition here. Does everyone see my cursor, by the way, when I'm sharing screen? Do you see the cursor? Yeah. So we have enumeration of the Byzantine churches here. We have Syrian. People more and more are associating with Edessa. It began in Nisibis. There was a famous Syriac school at Nisibis, and then it moved to Edessa, both in today's Turkey. So that's one was sort of as a geographical locator for the East Syrian tradition, although it spreads far east of that. We have the West Syrian tradition here, or also called the Antiochian. And people often use East Syriac or West Syriac as well, because they don't want to be confused with the country Syria, right? Because it's the reference Syrian means the Syriac language, the Semitic language related to Arabic and Hebrew, as spoken throughout, the Middle East. Then we have the Alexandrian, Coptic, and Ge'ez. Today in the Catholic Church, we have both an Eritrean Catholic Church established in 2014 and an Ethiopian Catholic Church, and they both use the Ge'ez rite, that is the Ethiopian rite, and the Armenian. This is another way of conceiving it. There are stories that are told in hagiography about the apostles going all over the world, including Thomas to India. In fact, quite plausibly so, because there were well-established trade routes, the spice trade, particularly to Kerala. We know that there were Greek and Roman garrisons stationed in southern India, and there was a synagogue there as well. And so it's quite plausible that Thomas went to preach to the Jews, actually, originally, the Jews living in India, and then eventually also interacting with what we would today call Hindus, although that nomenclature is more modern nomenclature. In other words, that people practicing Indian, in Indian, pagan Indian religion. So here is we're looking at this map here, and you're getting some sense of the Christian East. We've got, obviously, the Slavic world. We've got Greece itself, the Greek islands, Constantinople, Asia Minor, and Cappadocia is a very important region where St. Basil, St. Gregory Nazianzus, St. Gregory of Nyssa were from. Alexandria, which is the famous library in antiquity, very large Greek communities there since the time of Alexander the Great, and also in Antioch. It's the only city that's not here for some reason. That's roughly located about there. Today it's in ruins, Antakya in Turkey, and the patriarchs of Antioch have lived in Damascus for many centuries. Armenia and Persia, and the Church of the East is obviously in Persia and going further beyond Ethiopia down here.
I just had a quick question. I got
Please,
obsessed.
Julie.
Yeah, I got obsessed with this East-West Syriac and Edessa and Antioch. They're really all close together, aren't they? In that corner there.
But the dividing line becomes the border between Rome and the Persian Empire, the Sassanid Empire, right? Because Nisibis is in Nisib, I get this right, I get these two mixed up. Nisibis ends up falling on the Roman side of the border, and Edessa on the Persian side. Or maybe it's the other way around. In any event, the two schools, when the school moves, shoot. So someone could check that for me on their phone if you don't mind. I get that mixed up. the school of Edessa moves to Nisibis, or does it move the other way around? They're both in Turkey today, but one was in the Persian Empire, and therefore it changed the orientation of the school completely, because basically the East Syrian Christians were the Christians. They were a minority, but they were the Christians in the Persian Empire. Most people were Zoroastrian, obviously, but whereas the Syriac Christians in the Roman Empire were one among many other communities of Christians in the Roman Empire, including Latins and Greeks and Copts and so forth. So the Syriac Christians in the Persian Empire, then their faith develops not only because they are the exclusive church within that body politic, and they achieve a tolerated status, but also they sort of, after the Council of Ephesus, we'll come to momentarily, they direct their attention eastward and end up interacting with cultures like those of Central Asia and China and India that the other churches will not encounter for many, many centuries still to come. Did anyone find that, by the way? Joshua, if you don't mind looking that up for me,
I got it, Brian, from good old Wikipedia.
So, yeah.
So they were, my understanding from what I just read is that they were distinct, the school of Nisibis and the school of Edessa.
Yep.
And then when Saint Ephrem moved to Edessa, Nisibis thus ceased to exist except as a component of Edessa.
Right, there we go. Mm-hmm. And Edessa is the one that fell within the Persian Empire.
Okay.
Is that right? Is that what it says? Yeah. The border shifted, eh? Yeah, because of the wars that they were having a frequent war of Byzantium and the Persian Empire, the Sassanid Persians at war. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'll let, we can clarify that later. So actually, it's in my notes for when we talk about the Syrian tradition next week. So if you all have your own reasons to be in this class. One very good reason is simply to understand the way in which the churches have historically related to one another at a time when there really was a unity in diversity. We lack that today. We have all sorts of diversity today, but we lack unity in one takes the church as a whole. And if we're ever to reestablish that unity, surely we have to at least get to know one another. John Paul II, as I said before, took the lead on this as really the first pope to visit many of these Eastern churches and interact with them, and the first pope to preside at the full spectrum of the Eastern rites, right? For John Paul II actually presided at Byzantine, Armenian, Syro-Malabar, Chaldean liturgies, and so forth, showing his, obviously he has to be told what to do, he doesn't understand them very well, but in other words, showing that these are fully Catholic traditions that he feels a personal connection, responsibility for even. The Pope, at the best of times, and John Paul II was one of I think the better examples of this, saw himself as a bridge builder. So the word pontiff means bridge builder, pontifex, right? Between East and West. Diversity is something we see, of course, in the early church right from the get-go. In the book of Acts, the miracle of Pentecost, they'll be celebrating very soon, everybody is hearing the gospel in their own language. But there's a struggle because the people of Israel, or the Jewish believers in Christ, are unclear as to how these new people who want to join the church, whether they are to what extent they are to embrace Hebraic heritage. To what extent does embracing Christ imply embracing the Hebraic heritage? I mentioned yesterday that this is sorted out in different ways. In the book of Acts, yes, we see the first council where they say, okay, we abstain from fornication and from meat that's been strangled and from idolatry. But as they go along, there's a deep reflection on to what extent this Old Testament heritage should be preserved, both in terms of, for example, the frequency with which the Old Testament scriptures are publicly proclaimed. You may know that in the Byzantine Rite, we only read the Old Testament on the eves of feasts and in Lent. We don't read it at the regular Divine Liturgy. It's the same thing was traditionally the case in the Latin West. The same thing is the case in the Coptic Church, for example. They have a reading, every liturgy, they have a reading from a Catholic epistle, a Pauline epistle, the Acts of the Apostles, from the Lives of the Saints, and from the Gospels. 5 readings. And they have Psalms, but they have no readings from the Old Testament except in other services, right? Not in the Divine Liturgy. The East Syrian Church, however, the Chaldean, Syro-Malabar, and the West Syrian have readings from the Old Testament in the Divine Liturgy. So these traditions, Syriac language, much more conscious of their proximity to the Hebraic heritage than the Greeks and then the Latins. So this sense of how much our own culture and how close it is to the cultures through which the faith has come gives is a dynamic that then that shapes the formation of these different traditions. It should cause us all to be quite sober, the very phenomenon of anti-Semitism throughout the history of the church. If one looks at it from the vantage point today of after the Holocaust, we're often, I think, quite shocked to think, how could there be the case that so many Christians could have had such enmity for Jewish people, as if somehow they forgot that the person they were worshiping hanging on the cross was Jewish, and his mother was Jewish, and all his best friends were Jewish, right? But they seem to have forgotten that. In other words, there's a cognitive dissonance there, that they are worshiping the Jewish Lord and venerating his Jewish disciples and his mother, feel so disconnected from the Jewish heritage that they can then persecute people who are the representatives of that heritage. So that's something, and this is not localized. I mean, one finds it all across the Christian world, but it's differently thematized in different places, and certainly takes more egregious expression in one place than another. So as the gospel spreads, the early inhabitants of the cities are where the faith takes root, right? Are the ones who receive the gospel most readily. And in each of these cities, their local culture and language lends the development of the liturgy a particular form. Sometimes these places are multi-ethnic, right? Antioch was a multi-ethnic and multilingual city. So was Alexandria. So was Rome, right? We had Syrian Christians in Rome, Greek Christians in Rome, and Latin-speaking Christians in Rome. So the liturgy, the Mass in Rome, was in Greek until the fourth and perhaps early 5th century. And the remnants of that can be seen in the fact that they sing the Kyrie eleison, Christe eleison, and for example, traditionally on Good Friday, singing the Trisagion, also in Latin as well as in Greek as well as in Latin. In fact, little bits of Greek are in every single liturgy, although in some cases it's very, very minimal in terms of just some phrases, nomenclature. But in most of the traditions even say things in Greek, even though the liturgy as a whole is not in a language at all close to Greek. So the Syrian Western tradition uses Greek words, stomen kalos, let us be attentive, right? The Latin tradition is the Kyrie eleison. The Slavic churches, even though when they use Slavonic, end up preserving some things in Greek. The Hagios, the Trisagion, when a bishop is present, for example. The Coptic church has taken a whole bunch of words into Coptic from Greek, they're cognates. And even Ethiopians say Kyrie eleison, which if you don't, when they're singing it, you don't realize till you think about it that that's actually Kyrie eleison. So the Greek influence that was there because of Alexander the Great and so the Hellenistic period permeates into all the traditions to one extent or another. Each of these centers has not only its own language and culture, but it develops its own theological style. If you read the church fathers from Antioch versus those from Alexandria, they interpret the scripture in different ways. The Latin fathers speak differently. Ephraim the Syrian writes everything in poetry, whereas many of the Greek fathers are quite happy to write in a philosophical idiom. Think of Basil the Great and Gregory of Nazianzus, for example. And in each of these places, we get different experiments with how to live a radical Christian life, right? How to, for example, monastic life takes on different forms. In the early Syrian churches, even before Nicaea, we see examples of small groups of men and women living, the so-called devotee, living even on the edge of a village, sometimes living with their families, but consecrating themselves to celibacy and to poverty and to continual prayer. In Egypt, we see the emergence of monastic life, both of the Eremitic kind and the communal kind, Cenobitic, and that eventually, of course, spreads to east and west, Saint Basil in the east and Saint Benedict in the west, but it takes on different forms in those places. This ferment, this kind of blending of traditions is what we can think of as really is as things were sort of being mixed around in the pre-Nicene period. We don't see a lot of evidence of things being nailed down, specific rites, specific texts. Even when we have evidence of that, it's not clear that these things were universally adopted, right? So we know we have some examples of from the 3rd century, right, Addai and Mari, and in fact even the Roman canon, but there seems to have been a fair amount of extemporizing, even in public prayer, up until the 4th century. The fact that many of our anaphoras are named after the church fathers, especially the church fathers of the 4th century, Chrysostom, Basil, Nazianzus, Cyril of Alexandria, Athanasius. It doesn't mean, of course, that these church fathers actually authored every single jot and tittle of the prayer. Bradshaw and Johnson will quickly disabuse you of that. But the fact that they're attributed to these people, and very often they did have a hand in writing them, shows you that at the 4th century, something really kind of things come into focus. We have the Christianization of the empire, and an attempt now to kind of consolidate a lot of things, consolidate church structures, nail down clearly what the canon of scripture is. So we get the great codices, right, Vaticanus, Alexandrinus, and so forth, that try to compile all the official scriptures. We get the first and second ecumenical council attempting to clarify the faith, dealing with the proximate causes, obviously Arianism, and the pneumatomachoi for the second ecumenical council. But the very fact that there was a Christian empire as such enabled these councils to truly be cosmopolitan, to have a fairly diverse representation from across the church. Now, of course, there were not many Ethiopians, if any, showing up at the Council of Nicaea or First Council of Constantinople or the Armenians. There were always people who were, because of their geographical and cultural linguistic location, were somewhat on the margins. But it's important that this 4th century and its first 2 councils were accepted ultimately by everyone, right? Not the Arians. Yes, we know there were Aryan communities in the West that survived many, many centuries. The Gothic peoples had their own Aryan Bible and their own Aryan liturgy, but all of them were eventually assimilated into Catholic Christianity in the West. Even the Assyrian Church of the East, which rejects all the councils of the 5th century, accepts the first 2 councils and the Nicene Creed, which is used universally throughout all the apostolic churches that have survived down to the present, even though that creed is used with slight differences, not just the filioque, but also the filioque. But there's different phrases in the Ethiopian recension and in the Armenian recension, as you will see. The question of the extent to which this was legitimate, that is, this baptizing of the empire, is something that, of course, many people have asked themselves over the centuries. And if you have any familiarity with Protestantism, you understand that many people would be rightly suspicious of this quote-unquote conversion. The whole state church model, the model of what the Byzantines called symphonia, right? This harmony, this coming together of state and church, where the emperor and the patriarchs kind of collaborate and to have a division of labor between the heavenly or spiritual matters and earthly matters. But if you were coming from the point of view of the 3rd century, where the church had been, especially under Diocletian, quite vigorously persecuted, in fact, the Coptic Church dates its church calendar from the first year of 284 of the reign of Emperor Diocletian, because the persecution was so intense. They call it the year of the martyrs, right? So if you're coming from the experience of martyrdom, you might well think this is actually a very good thing that the empire first tolerate and then embrace Christianity. After all, Christians have been praying for centuries in the Lord's Prayer, "Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven." So maybe people at the time were saying, hey, maybe this is the Lord's finally answering our prayer. The kingdom is coming on earth. All the nations are being gathered together now. Think of the empire as sort of embracing civilization as they did. And therefore, we're entering into this golden age. In fact, people even today look back on the 4th century and say it was a golden age in terms of the flourishing of the liturgies that we still have. They begin to be written down, crystallized, and adopted within their respective spheres of influence. We still use the anaphora of Chrysostom and of Basil. We still use the Roman canon, Eucharistic prayer number 1 in the current, in the Novus Ordo. We still use the Copts still use the anaphora of Cyril of Alexandria and the Armenians of St. Athanasius and so forth. Now, you probably know from your studies in church history that there were 5 major centers within the Roman Empire that kind of existed as a kind of a fraternity. We know, for example, reading the works of St. Irenaeus in the 2nd century, that there was a kind of mutual recognition that happened among the churches based on 3 criteria. But the fact that there was an established succession, he calls it succession of the presbyters. And he writes down, as Eusebius too, the lists of people who were like appointed by people who were appointed by people who were appointed all the way back to the apostles. Of course, this is a very big debate at the Reformation about the legitimacy of this, but we see very early in the church, people are concerned to establish that. So there's the succession of presbyters, there is the use of canonical scriptures, right? Scriptures that are recognized, like the different churches recognize the same scriptures, and that you read the Gospel of Mark, we respect that one as well. We know that came from Mark, who was associated with Peter, and therefore it has an apostolic origin. And thirdly, the rule of faith, canon pistis or regula fide. These were the 3 criteria which for Irenaeus of Lyon and others after him allowed the incipient church to recognize itself across a variety of cultures and languages that enabled people from faraway corners of, say, Ireland, Roman Britain to Ethiopia to nonetheless have a sense that they are part of the same church. By the 4th century, this mutual recognition kind of tracks the the important centers of civil society. So Alexandria, which has an apostolic foundation, but was also one of the leading centers of the Roman Empire. So was Rome, so was Antioch, and of course, so was Constantinople. Jerusalem is the outlier. It's not important to the Roman Empire, it's from its civil status, but of course it's important for purely reasons and is included in this pentarchy or principle of 5 as well. Now that hardly accounts for the full spectrum of Christianity, however, because the Armenians aren't part of the pentarchy because most of their nation ends up falling within the Persian Empire, right? Armenia gets divided between Byzantium and Persia, and they are not, so they, while being the first nation to officially adopt Christianity, according to their own hagiography of this Gregory of the Illuminator, who comes to the enlightener of Armenia, they are not present in the consciousness of the imperial Christians living within the Roman Empire. People know about the Armenians, but they're not sort of included as one of these leading sees. Nor is Ethiopia, right? It's under Alexandria, nor is the Church of Persia, and which has its center ultimately in what's today's Baghdad, Seleucid Ctesiphon. So, and much less would people have any sense of what was going on in India, right? I mean, yes, there were trade routes and people heard about it, but actually seems to be a lot of confusion. People use the word India to mean everything from, the Persian Gulf, like what's Yemen and around there, the UAE, Dubai and so forth, that region all the way to Iraq and Iran to India. People use the term India in a very vague, loose fashion. And we can see this in the Church Fathers and even in our hymnography sometimes, Byzantine hymnography. So their sense of geography wasn't always exactly clear. They knew that there was this, this principle of 5 that was, and many people Church Fathers who write about this, praising it as sort of as part of the divine plan that these churches together, as it were, rule the church. Well, that does not last very long. And if you've done some church history, you know this already, that things kind of get messy after the Second Ecumenical Council. Admittedly, they were messy even in the 4th century, but they seem to more or less get things hammered out, with the exception of the people who insist on hanging on to the Arian Christology, as I say, in the West for centuries to come. But in terms of the church, and of course we could be cynical about this. If with a church history course, we could sort of talk about, is history written by the victors? You know, to what extent were these councils really ecumenical? Was there ever any council that was actually received by every person? Because Eastern Christians like to talk about councils being ecumenical in virtue of their reception. How do you measure that, et cetera, et cetera? We won't get into that now. We'll take it as sort of a topos, or as a point de départ, that these councils, for at least the first two, were ecumenical, that they were pretty much received everywhere from Ireland to Ethiopia, evidenced by the fact that people prayed the Nicene Creed, again, from North Africa to the Baltic Sea. Everyone accepted the consolidation, eventually, of these councils. This was not to be the case, however, with the Third Ecumenical Council of Ephesus, or the Fourth Council, which led to the greatest schisms the church has known prior to the 16th century. Right, the Council of Ephesus, in which became an issue of rivalry between Alexandria and Constantinople. Alexandria had not taken kindly to be put in third place after Constantinople, right? Because it was an important city in the ancient world long before Byzantion, this little fishing village, became the imperial capital. And so they saw it as a Johnny-come-lately. This sort of, it's as if somehow, you know, like, I don't know, what's this, some small town like Belleville, Ontario, were to somehow now become the capital, and everyone in Ottawa was all of a sudden, was not likely to think of Belleville as being really the center of Canadian culture just because it's been given this political importance. So Alexandria sort of had an axe to grind. It was now third in the taxis, or the order. And we see at the Council of Ephesus, this comes out. Cyril of Alexandria is there. He insists, and the West, the Latin and Greeks and many of the Greeks tend to agree with him, that Mary should be called Mother of God, Theotokos, the traditional title that we can see already in the 3rd century, early 3rd century, in the famous prayer, Beneath Your Compassion, Sub Tuum Presidium, which we have in several languages. And there's a very interesting article by Maxwell Johnson, who happens to be a Lutheran, by the way, one of the authors of this book, but it's on precisely the ubiquity and antiquity of Marian devotion in the church. It's very interesting. And he basically concludes that as far back as you can find any evidence of Christian devotion, you can find Marian veneration. So I'll put a reference to that for those who might like to explore that topic further. In any event, so Mater Dei, or Dei Genitrix, was the term used in the West. Theotokos. Nestorius was willing to say Christotokos, Mother of Christ, but felt uncomfortable with the term Theotokos because he thought it suggested that Mary was the mother of the Father, or something like that, or caused the divine nature to come, something like that. In fact, if tempers had been a little bit calmer, as is often the case in church conflicts, perhaps they would have been able to sort of agree to disagree, and agree that they could use different words to strike at, to aim towards the same mystery. But in fact, the council anathematizes Nestorius, and the Church of Persia, which in fact is not inclined, especially thinking in Syriac, to use the term Theotokos, this Greek term. Rather, they have their own titles for Mary in Syriac. They claim Nestorius as a kind of hero. In fact, one of their Eucharistic prayers is named after Nestorius. For them, he's a saint. They fall out of communion. Nestorius's followers basically flee to the Persian Empire, where they're unmolested by other Christians, because there aren't any other Christians except the Syriac Christians, who, as a body, embrace the Nestorian Christology. We have another course in the Institute where we get into the nitty-gritty of Christology, and you read actually the text of the Church Fathers, so we won't spend too much time on that now. Suffice to say, and perhaps some of you already know this, Nestorius thought of Christ as having two natures which were concretized in sort of two persons. For him, person was not, Jesus wasn't schizoid, he wasn't like split personality, but he felt that they had to use the term konoma, which meant a concretized nature, not just nature in the abstract, but a nature that actually existed. And this language of divinity and humanity with their respective natures really irked frightened people who thought it might lead to a thinking of the divinity and humanity in Christ being separate. In fact, the Copts say in their divine liturgy, right before communion, I believe and confess that never was his divinity parted from his humanity, not for a moment, not for a twinkling of an eye. On the one hand, the Copts acknowledge, yes, there was divinity and humanity. Everyone acknowledges that, actually. But it's whether you want to speak about that, those two properties within one nature, and that was the Coptic following St. Cyril said, there's one incarnate nature of the incarnate word. Before the union, before the incarnation, there was obviously God, qua God, and humanity. But after the incarnation, there's just one. Is divine and human. It's mixed water and wine, so to speak, rather than water and oil, which separate, as it were, if you let them sit, right, in a glass. So the Nestorian, church stressed the duality, but not at the expense of the unity, I think, if you give them a fair shake. And same thing on the Oriental Orthodox, or the Orthodox side at that point. However, there were certainly people in both camps who pressed things. People who stressed the unity and said that the divinity swallowed up the humanity. There was a guy named Eutyches who taught that. And there were people on the other side who so differentiated the humanity and divinity in Christ that it was difficult to see how he was one person. In any event, people at the time felt quite passionately about these Christological debates, not least because they tended to attract to them a certain kind of quality that we might today associate with rival sports teams, that sort of our group, our people, our city thinks this way, and I'm with them, I'm with my people, and you're with your people, so what you guys teach isn't right, and even if it were, we couldn't embrace it because it's not what our people and what our fathers and so forth say. And linguistic differences exacerbated this because people were not able to understand one another. Often these councils were held in Greek, and people speaking Syriac Armenian didn't know what they were saying, and vice versa. The upshot of it is that we have a separation in the 5th century of the Assyrian Church of the East, the Oriental Orthodox, because the Copts, and then many Christians in the western part of the Syriac-speaking Christians within the Roman Empire, the Ethiopians, by extension, the Copts, and the Armenians do not accept the Council of Chalcedon and form their own federation, and they have their own hierarchy from the already actually in the 5th century in some places, and in the 6th century for sure, they all have their own bishops, and places like Antioch and Alexandria end up having a parallel episcopate. There's a Chalcedonian and a non-Chalcedonian in Alexandria, and a Chalcedonian and a non-Chalcedonian in Antioch. So we have the pentarchy, but it's mortally wounded, we might say. However, the Greeks, the Byzantines, or let's say the inhabitants of Constantinople, who see those councils as having been ecumenical, as do the Latin Christians, they kind of stress their mutual relationship. So they keep trying to bring these other people back on side in the subsequent councils, the 5th and 6th ecumenical councils particularly, but it never really works, especially as after the arrival of Islam makes communication with these other Eastern churches quite difficult. It's important to remember that the Byzantines thought of themselves as Romans, so they were Greek speakers. By the 7th century, they still used some Latin before that in law and so forth, but the liturgy was in Greek. But they lose touch with these other Eastern Christians, and they certainly Syriac speakers and Armenians, and they eventually lose touch with the Latin West, even though they continue calling themselves Romans, Romai, right? They don't call themselves Byzantines. That's what we call them today to distinguish them from the Romans who lived in Rome prior to the fall of the Roman Empire. But this Roman mentality, or Romanitas, is very important for understanding the Eastern Orthodox Church particularly, and the ongoing model they have of the Tsar, right? Caesar, for example, in Russia, or Putin, who acts like a Caesar, right? So the state and the church collaborating. That idea of the state and church being unified is something that makes a lot of sense to Western Christians and to Eastern Orthodox, but does not make any sense to the Copts or to the Assyrians, for example, who have never had the luxury of having a state church. The Copts have always been a minority. First, they were a minority among pagans. Then they were a minority. Then they were, persecuted by pagans. Then persecuted by Chalcedonians, and then persecuted by Muslims. They've never had the state to themselves. Armenia has, yes, but not the Assyrian Church of East, which first lived under the Zoroastrian Persians and then under Islam, and certainly the Christians in India, who were surrounded by this plurality of religions. So the very idea of the Christian empire, which in the Byzantine world ultimately becomes sort of a Christian nation, right? That the Serbs, the Bulgarians, the Romanians, everybody wants their own patriarch and patriarchate. As soon as they get their political autonomy, they want an ecclesiastical autonomy. And we see that right up to the present day. We now have an Orthodox Church of Ukraine because we have an independent Ukraine. Legitimately, according to Eastern precedent, there should be an independent church. But there's always resistance throughout history. Whenever people try to get that independence, it's always messy, and it is the case, of course, today. It's also important to understand this concept of empire to make sense of why the Byzantine rite is so conditioned by the worship of Constantinople. This one church in the Byzantine tradition, more than in any other liturgy, one particular church building basically creates the pattern for worship for everyone, right? We have a little chapel at the Sheptytsky Institute in Toronto. It's called St. Sophia, Holy Wisdom. It doesn't look like this, I grant you, but we think of it like this. In other words, when we're in that space, we're actually, the way we serve the liturgy is very much like, on a microcosmic scale, the way the liturgy was served in Constantinople. The very fact that we distinguish, even in a small space between the altar and the nave, and we have these processions that come in and out and around the space, harkens back to the processions that they would have throughout the streets of Constantinople from one church to another. And for example, the great entrance that we have when we bring in the gifts, the unconsecrated gifts, is what was done at Constantinople when they had a separate building where they would prepare the bread and wine, skeophalakion, and they would then bring it in the middle of the service to the altar. And that's exactly what we do at the great entrance, even though now we have that place of preparation within the altar itself. So I said earlier that after the arrival of Islam, we get a kind of a separation, a really de facto separation of what was already de jure separation between the Oriental traditions and the imperial traditions. Alexandria and Antioch not only end up having these rival episcopal lines, but they get Byzantinized, right? So in Alexandria and in Antioch, they used not the rite of St. John Chrysostom, they used the liturgy of St. Mark in Alexandria, the liturgy of St. James in Antioch, in Greek, yes, but different liturgies, not the rites that are used in Constantinople. But out of the desire to show loyalty to Constantinople, right, and to show that they were not these schismatic people who did not accept those councils, they end up using the rite that is used at the center of the world, so to speak, at the imperial center, that is in the Church of Hagia Sophia. This is very important because it explains why Eastern Orthodox today basically all have the same liturgy. It's not because they originally did. There was a time when they didn't. Even, and we hear it's as late as the 12th century, we have Theodore of Balsamon saying, yeah, there was a time when people used the rite of St. Mark, but we don't really know if we can trust that anymore because it's been tainted by being appropriated by those Monophysite heretics. And same thing with the rite of St. James. So we think everybody should use the rite of New Rome, the rite of New Rome. All right. Now there are three churches in the history of the church which tend to think of themselves as having the right to dominate everybody else. The old Rome, the new Rome, and then the third Rome, okay? Most of the other churches tend to stand like, we have our little sphere of influence. The Armenians are like, we'll do our thing, you do your thing, leave us alone, we'll leave you alone, we're all good, right? Whereas Rome, the Catholic Rome, wants to basically run the whole church. because they believe that Peter has been given the keys of the kingdom. Okay, we got that. It's our scriptural argument, okay, by and large. Then the New Rome says, no, we run the whole church. Why? Because we were given that responsibility as being second in command at the Council of Chalcedon. We were second in command at actually in 381, Council of Constantinople, and then we were given responsibility for all the barbarians at the Council of Chalcedon. It's one of the disciplinary canons. And once Rome's not in the picture, ergo, we are now in charge of everything, okay? And the Greeks still think that way. And then we have the Church of Moscow, which strangely is a bit of a Johnny-come-lately, but ultimately ends up thinking the same way. After the old Rome's gone heretical, the new Rome has fallen to Islam, someone has to take care of the Orthodox Church. Guess that's going to be us. And that mentality is still there today, as I said, with the relationship we see between the Russian Orthodox and Putin and their activities, not only with Ukraine, but including that, when one can see it in their attempt to dominate the churches of Estonia, Poland, Czech Republic, Georgia, and so forth. And in fact, to be the protector of Christians in the Holy Land. In fact, the Russian Church, to its credit, has always been very generous in sending donations to the pilgrim sites, building up the pilgrimage sites, and offering support, material support to the beleaguered Christians of the Middle East. But if one were to be cynical, it's also because that there has been this sense that they have not quite jurisdiction, but they have the right to exercise a kind of influence. So the way in which the liturgy then develops in different places is in part shaped by this imperial consciousness or lack thereof, right? It's not coincidental that Byzantine bishops have used double-headed eagle as their symbol. This was a symbol of the Byzantine emperor, right? And Byzantine bishops today have a jezl, like a staff that has the, not every bishop, but the patriarch has one with the double-headed eagle, and all Byzantine bishops use these rugs, right? These what do we call them in Ukrainian? Yuri, what do we call them in Ukrainian, the rugs for the bishop? Natalia, do you know? Oh, the name's failing me. Anyways.
I don't know. I just call them rugs.
Yeah. Yuri, what do we call the rugs that the bishop stands on?
The carpet?
Carpet, yeah.
I don't know.
What do you call that? It has a special name. What's it called?
We call it orlets.
Yeah, orlets, duh. Yeah, okay, there we go. So the orlets, yeah, it actually has the double-headed eagle so that the bishop is standing on that when he's blessing and reading the gospel and offering the anaphora and so forth. So the church is really, the stories are differently told, and you need to understand that it strikes quite deep to the heart. There are martyrs in the Coptic church, as I said, who were people put to death because they would not accept the Council of Chalcedon, and Byzantium sent soldiers to shove it down their throats, okay? And then meanwhile, you have people like Dioscorus and Severus, who are holy fathers for the Copts, and Ethiopians, and they're mentioned in their anaphora, and these guys are anathematized by the Byzantines. And we have feast days in which we sing about how bad those guys were because they confounded the reception of the ecumenical councils by not accepting Chalcedon and what came after. So we sing about the wicked Dioscorus and the evil Severus and so forth. Meanwhile, if you go to the Coptic church down the street, you'll hear, oh, and through the prayers of our holy father Severus and our blessed teachers, Dioscorus, enlightener of Egypt, this kind of thing. Right? So we have saints who are sort of people or heresiarchs and saints in different traditions. Well, you can imagine how confusing that gets if you are a Coptic Catholic or you are a Syrian Catholic who has a liturgy which exalts somebody who your fellow Catholics, like Byzantine and Roman Catholics, think of as a heretic because of the way you look at church history, right? So the sanctoral or the calendar of saints is itself instructive as to how the churches understand their own history. Who is the hero? Who are the heroes? Who are the villains? What are the great events? The Byzantine churches have lots of feast days in which we celebrate the ecumenical councils. The first council, the second council, the third council, then the first three councils, the first four councils, all seven councils, just the seventh council. We have discrete feast days for all of these things, as if to sort of make it really, really clear to our people how important these gatherings were for clarifying our faith.
Ryan, can I quickly ask you, what does it mean technically for an Orthodox church to become in full communion with the Roman Catholic Church? Do they accept like the full catechism, or is it just a mutual recognition, or coming under the Pope but still having its distinctive theology? And when does that enter the picture, or the first? I mean, you mentioned there are a few that were always in communion, but
so the first part, the answer to the first part of the question is, I'm writing a book on that, Josh. So you have to. My next book is called "What is Eastern Catholic Theology?" and it's going to ask that question. The fact is that it's different throughout the centuries, right? The different unions have different terms attaching to them that reflect the priorities and concerns of the period. There are unions that happen as recently as the early 20th century, right? The Syro-Malankara Church, when it comes into communion with Rome, it comes in basically holus bolus. It's this church in southern India and Kerala that uses the West Syrian liturgy. I'll explain that next week why they have that in the first place. So when they come in, it's really much as a sense of we want to be in communion with the Pope of Rome and the other churches in communion with him. We venerate the tradition of the West, but we also hold obviously our own liturgy and theology and spirituality in high regard. We see no incompatibilities here. So there was, at the time, there was no universal catechism that people were expected to adopt. It was simply at the most elemental level, it's a commemoration of the Pope in the liturgy, right? Even by the head of the church. So an acknowledgement that he has a universal ministry. Now, it gets much more complicated, because once you're in a relationship with somebody, it's a question of give and take. What do I have to, do I just have to acknowledge you, or do I have to talk to you? Do I actually have to eat with you? Do I have to share my money with you? Do I have to kind of clean up after you? Like, what do I have to do now that I'm in a relationship? Is this a friendship? Is this a marriage? Is this a father and son? Is this just acquaintances, right? And all of those models have kind of existed among the Eastern Catholics as they've tried to sort out what does it mean to relate to the other, and not just to Rome, but say to the other Eastern Catholics, right? Because in India, you already had the Syro-Malabar Catholics who follow the East Syrian liturgy. So now when a group of Orthodox in the early 20th century come into communion, the West Syrian tradition come into communion with Rome, they establish a new Catholic Church in India. So there's the Latin hierarchy, the Syro-Malabar hierarchy, and now there's the Syro-Malankara hierarchy. So how do they coordinate their activities such that they show the unity of the church amidst its diversity? That has been an ongoing, evolving thing, and many tensions along the way, because there's always a question of getting in each other's way, right? And of sheep stealing, one might say. There's that issue. Not mixed marriages, but people marrying, and then how does that affect the different communities where there's a flourishing of religious vocations or of resources, seminary, educational resources. How do people share these things? In fact, the churches in India, to my mind, have done a very good job, all things considered, of figuring this out compared to some of the other Eastern churches. But part of that is also reflected in the fact that the Catholic Church as a whole has had variety in its historical experience as to how, even within the Latin Rite, the different parts of the Latin Church relate to the center, right? So you have at the Second Vatican Council an attempt to kind of rebalance the ecclesiology such that they will stress the role of the diocesan bishop and even the role of regional synods of bishops, like the Canadian Council of Catholic Bishops, right? Versus the Vatican I, which stressed the role of the pontiff. So you have, not unlike in the early church, you have an attempt to sort out how do you have the Trinity be both one and three? Well, if it's one, then the threeness is really just kind of like modes of the oneness, right? Well, it's Sabellian heresy. We can't have that, the church says. Okay, fine, it's three. So we got like three gods, like tritheism? No, we can't have that either. Well, the Trinity is the model for our ecclesial life. And in the Catholic Church, it's really come home to roost with a vengeance, because we say there is this unity, and that unity with Christ, obviously, but manifest through communion with the successor of Peter. However, there is also this diversity. How diverse can you be before you're not in union anymore? How united do you have, how uniform do you have to be to show that you are united, right? And so it's definitely an ongoing thing. Now, second part of your question, the Maronites say that they were never out of communion with Rome, right? The Maronites emerged, their own history is somewhat shadowy. They emerge after the Council of Chalcedon, a 6th century figure of Saint Maron, and they're already in communion with Rome. They also recognize the Council of Chalcedon, and they recognize Latin and Greek Christian, but they're Syriac speakers, and they have tradition, and they're kind of localized in the mountains of Lebanon, and associated with this very important monastic figures of Saint Maron. So there is no Orthodox counterpart. So the Maronites could be one case study of how Eastern Church has always fought to maintain its unity, its own identity, but has felt it was a net benefit in being in communion with the Pope of Rome and the Catholic Church. And that benefit can be understood in very different ways. Sometimes it's been sort of, people say, well, there were economic or educational or political advantages to churches being in communion with Rome, and sometimes that was the case. Sometimes people have suffered for that, though, you see. So it's not at all, you can't just reduce it to that, because in Ukraine, for example, many Ukrainian Catholic bishops and priests, even Patriarch Slipe, would not have been persecuted after communism. They just become Orthodox, right? So they were actually, Patriarch Slipe was offered, he said, we'll make you Orthodox Patriarch, Metropolitan, but you just have to renounce your communion with Rome, and then we're all good, right? Because the communists said, we'll have one church that we recognize, one Orthodox church, and as long as you're part of that, that's fine. Even then, curtail your activities, but at least won't persecute you, right? But Orthodox who would not accept that, but also Eastern Catholics who would not accept that, for it. And so there clearly people, it's a level of, at their level of faith, there's a sense that this is actually important theologically, but then also empirically, in order to have some type of fullness. The other example that really throws a monkey in the wrench for people is the Byzantine Catholics of Sicily and Calabria. Strong Greek presence in southern Italy throughout the first millennium. There are many, many Greek monasteries. Italy. The only really surviving one is in Grottaferrata, south of Rome, but there were hundreds of monasteries, if you can believe it. And in fact, the majority of Christians were in places like Sicily were actually Greek-speaking Christians. So those people were always part of the Patriarchate of Rome. Like, no one ever said that they weren't part of the Patriarchate of Rome, that they never had, as it were, any, they belonged, but they were never Latin right. So the Patriarchate of Rome always had in its care, from time immemorial, Christians of different ritual traditions, Latin, Byzantine, and even in Rome, there seem to have been Syriac Christians in Rome itself. So that church still exists today. We call it the Italo-Greek, Italo-Albanian church, because it was reinforced by a 16th century, 17th century wave of Albanian immigrants, which sort of galvanized, sort of re-strengthened the church. But that exists today. This figure in my article, I think 60,000 people, something like that. Two dioceses and then the monastery. But this is really interesting because it's fully Italian. They use Greek and Italian and some Albanian. No problem thinking of themselves as Orthodox with respect to their liturgical tradition, but they see no conflict between being Orthodox and Catholic, because in their own history they were always both Orthodox and Catholic. You see. So that story it's a marginal, it's a small church, but it's instructive as to the complexity of this Eastern Catholic reality.
I find that very, very exciting, thrilling, because, the Romans always treated Greek Catholics sort of as, unwanted family members. And then here we have evidence that it's always been there. Like right in the back door. I'm amazed.
Sometimes we forget about some of our family members and we don't invite them to the table. That's the problem, right? You know, it's like, are you inviting that uncle over for Thanksgiving? No, not him. No, we don't. Well, he's our uncle, but we don't like him. You know, you're right. So no, don't get me wrong. There were some strong efforts to Latinize the Italo-Albanian, Italo-Greeks, and there were many more places where they had the Byzantine liturgy in southern Italy than they do today. Today, it's quite localized. Like not even, like most people in Sicily are Roman Catholic, but there are Greek Catholics there. Same thing in Calabria. There are many more people, and you'll meet them. If you meet anyone from Calabria or Sicily who thinks they're Roman Catholic, but if you ask them a little bit, like, what's your name? If their name has any Greek in it, you might say, yeah, you know, you probably were actually Byzantine, right? About like 4 generations ago. Or even when they came, you know, even there were people who came to New York and they tried to establish an Italo-Greek presence there, but they weren't able to make it really thrive. But there was an association, not even really a parish, that would put on periodic services. Today there's actually a parish in Las Vegas, of all places, that's under the Melkite bishop, but it's Italo-Greek Byzantine Catholic. You can go visit it when you're in Vegas for more nefarious pursuits. We don't need to ask about that. Okay, so.
I have a question about the Maronites. How are they permitted to retain their right?
Well, permitted, in other words.
I mean, wasn't there a big push at the Council of Trent to unify everything?
No. Trent was really concerned rather with dealing with Protestantism. There was not too much there dealing with interest at that point. It was really Florence and Ferrara, Florence, where they get that 1439 to 1445. Is that right? Yeah, where they sort out that. So they have a number of unions that are actually celebrated at Florence, which are really paper unions because they don't take hold. But there's a model that's adopted at Florence, which is recognize the Pope of Rome, don't say that everything we believe about, you know, purgatory, indulgences, whatever, is heretical, and accept that the filioque is okay, even if you don't use it, but don't say that it's wrong for us to use it, you know? And so they kind of a model for like, this is how this can work. We have to still be able to do what we do, and you can do what you do as long as it doesn't look too weird to us. You know? And so that has kind of like a back and forth, like in 1596 at the Union of Brest, the you know, the bishops in Ukraine who are requesting union, they basically say they have their is it 30 articles, I think, of the Union of Brest, where they're basically like, yeah, pretty much we're going to do everything like we've already done it. We're just like letting you know that we're, you know, like we're following the Holy Fathers exactly as it's been handed down to us. And we don't want anyone to tell us that we have to use unleavened bread or anything like that. And Rome says, yeah, okay, fine. And it's actually later, even the filioque, they're like, we're not using the filioque, but we don't mind that you do, but we're not going to do that because it's not part of our liturgy. And Rome's like, that's okay. And then really in the centuries that follow, where some people on the Roman side are like, well, maybe you should kind of differentiate yourself from those Orthodox schismatics, but it's actually often Ukrainian, you know, Eastern Catholics themselves to say, yeah, maybe we should differentiate ourselves from those schismatics, right? You know, and so if we put the filioque in, that will show that we're not those guys. We're part of these guys, you see, this team. So that, and that still, tension is still there today. Like if you go to our churches in Ukraine, people use the filioque all over the place. Oh, yeah. Ukrainian Catholics. But in Canada, it's almost non-existent. Like it would shock me if I went to a church and I heard the filioque in our church. I'm like, what are you doing? Like that's not like, and our liturgical, our anthology doesn't have it and so forth. Whereas in Ukraine, people are shocked sometimes if they don't hear it, you know. So because they've again come out of communism, and again, Yuri can correct me if I'm wrong here, but under communism, where the official church was the Orthodox Church, it was no virtue to sort of be more Orthodox than the Orthodox kind of thing, right? Because the Catholics felt no shame in holding on to distinct, like even Latin customs, if it helped differentiate them from the church that was colluding with communism. In the North America, it's a different kettle of fish, and in independent Ukraine it is too. So the newer generation of Ukrainian Catholic clergy formed at places like Ukrainian Catholic University, they're more Orthodox than the Orthodox sometimes in a good way. In other words, they often will combine a very great fidelity and zeal for the Eastern liturgical traditions and theology and spirituality with a great emphasis on education, which has always been the genius of the West. and a great desire for, ecumenism, right? A great sense of openness to learn from and collaborate with Orthodox brethren as much as possible. So you get really different models. It's a moving target, shall we say. It's a kind of an organic thing, but it is very, very messy. And in some sense, not just whether it's Orthodox or Catholic, but with Catholic Church, you're choosing a different set of problems. Like you, by joining one or by staying in one, if you're raised in it, you're embracing certain virtues, I think, but also certain particular pathologies that are related to the history, as it were, of that body. All right, moving on. So the Greeks, I've said several times that these liturgies are distinguished in terms of their cultural traits. The Greeks, we know, love philosophy, and philosophical language is all throughout the Byzantine liturgy. By contrast, the Syriac liturgy, all liturgies are poetic, but the Syriac liturgy puts raises the bar. I mean, Ephraim the Syrian only wrote theology in poetry. Like, that was the way he wrote theology, was by writing poetic stanzas. This is not find a Latin or Greek author who only writes theology, a theological author who writes exclusively through poetry. They write apologias, they write exegeses, they write commentaries and so forth, letters, but they don't think of writing all their theology in poetry, but Ephraim does. Interestingly, Ephraim the Syrian's work is used in all the Syriac churches, which are not in communion with each other, however, right? So the West Syrian tradition, the Maronites, the Syriac Orthodox, the Assyrian Church of the East, the Chaldeans, everybody sings the hymns of St. Ephraim. It's like they're unified in St. Ephraim, even if, and maybe because the poetic way of expressing oneself leaves room for more, it's more flex, right? It leaves more room for interpretation than a more strictly philosophical approach, which kind of says you got to kind of accept this or not. Like it's more cut and dried. And so the ambivalence, the very fact that these different East Syriac churches, which don't agree on Christology, technically speaking, can nonetheless sing Ephraim's hymns about Christ together, say melodies even. It's like poetry finds a way to bypass some of the, the dogmatic conflicts that were represented by these ecumenical councils. So we have the Greeks stressing philosophy, the Latin church, however, stressing practicality, right? They have to build roads, aqueducts, armies, fight barbarians, preserve Roman law. And still today, people would often think, it's a bit of a caricature, but think of the West as being focused on law, on forensic categories, right? On canon law, or thinking in juridical terms and being focused on juridical questions. Don't get me wrong, Byzantines can focus on jurisdiction too. That's why Moscow is up all, we can't stand there being an independent church in Ukraine. It's like, that's our jurisdiction, like Estonia, that's our jurisdiction, that's our jurisdiction. So people can fight about that too in the East, but in the West, it tends, law tends to be sort of almost like a metaphor for how they approach many different things. I think, and maybe Joshua could correct me on this if he thinks I'm misrepresenting it, but it seems to me that the focus in the 16th century debates on soteriology, right, on this doctrine of salvation, it very much takes place in people debating faith and works in legal terms, right? The focus is on justification, and the model of the courtroom seems to predominate. It's quite interesting what in certain contexts gets debated, and other churches just seem to bypass it altogether. In the East, they debate a lot of things, like using icons or how we should speak about Christ, but no one ever gets riled up about faith and works. No one actually gets riled up about soteriology. Everyone pretty much says, yeah, Christ is risen from the dead, trampling death by death, and to those in the tombs giving life. Yep, that's how it works. Jesus is God. God comes in, takes on the human nature, saves it from itself, imparts eternal life, and we get to share in that eternal life through our life in the sacraments in the church through baptism. And that's what, and they would say, look at, say, Philippians, is it Philippians 2:4, work out your salvation with fear and trembling, for it is God who works in you to will and to act according to his good purpose. So where's the problem? Work it out, because it's God who works in you. It's the same Greek word, energizete. Energize your salvation, because it's God who energizes you. No problem, right? And yet in the West, it was a really big problem. Like, how do you figure out this salvation? Is it faith? Are we justified by God? Or do we justify ourselves, or the merits of the saints, or what have you? So it's important to see that I think the cultural vocabulary, like literally the language, but then the broader, I mean, obviously people having debates in French and German, all sorts of languages, the Reformation in the West, vocabulary is often shaped by things that, conditions that are, right, that derive from a previous inheritance. Forensic and legal way of thinking, it trace sort of the theological debates of the West to of the Latin Roman mind, even as one can see the mind of the Greeks animating these very nuanced Christological debates in the ecumenical councils, at which even people at the time, some people said, come on, guys, like nature, persons, the apostasy, substantia, like, is this just like so much, they do the word logomachy, fighting over words, like Christ is human, what's the problem? Okay, we know he's both, you know? And the fact, of course, people can get over these debates because John Paul II, another one of the things he did when he would visit places, he met with the head of the Armenian Church, the head of the Pope Shenouda of the Coptic Church, and Karakin II of the Armenian Church, and then Ignatius Zaka of the Syriac Orthodox, and they produced joint statements on Christology where they both agreed that the other believed basically the same thing, and that people had misunderstood one another in the past, and that no one formula was necessary as long as we both recognize that there's, you know, full divinity and full humanity. And in the case of the Syriac Orthodox, they went as far as saying that there could be sharing in the sacraments, and that is actually what happens. So if you go to the Middle East or India as a Catholic and you go to a Syriac Orthodox church, they will allow you to receive communion because their head of their church agreed with John Paul II that where and when people needed access to one another's altars or for other, you know, grave reasons or good reasons, they interpret that generally quite generously, people could receive the Eucharist. However, if you would try that, say as a Catholic going to some other churches, you would certainly not be welcome to approach the altar. So these things can, the ability to both make distinctions with a difference, but also make distinctions sometimes without a difference. That seems to me more something that the Greeks are very good at, you know. And then the Syriacs again focused on really on, I think, a more poetic, on the role of the imagination and more kind of a very earthy, very embodied sense of piety. If you read Ephraim's poetry, it's all about oil and perfume and pearls. Like, it's like he's really excited about these things that you can smell and taste and touch, and that he talks about Christ as incense. Jesus is the incense of God. Mary is the golden censer upon which the coal burned, and then the incense of Christ, like this kind of thing, which is not really a way of thinking that an image that would be very prominent in, say, Latin, if at all, in Latin or Greek hymnography, but it's all over the place in Syriac hymnography. Jesus is the oil, Jesus is the incense. Please, Michael, a question.
Yeah, so now we've got to the Great Schism between Rome and Eastern churches. So, but as we're going through this, I'm hearing that within Eastern churches, there's some agreements about theology and other things, but whether it's schisms, but there's a lot of disagreements and division, and it doesn't seem to be a lot of unity other than being under the same label.
Yeah, so yes and no. So, I mean, if you were, you know, if you live in the Middle East, this is very common, especially in the Middle East, because of the, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. You will find that not only Catholics and Orthodox, but the different kinds of Eastern Christians, Assyrians, Chaldeans, Syriac Orthodox, the laity will very often go to each other's services and often receive the sacraments. And you're Christian, you're Christian, you're Christian, in other words, you're not a Muslim, right?
So they identify as, identifying as Eastern has importance more than being Roman Catholic.
Yeah, well, but even just identifying as Christian, right? So like in the Middle East, often people will, I mean, they wouldn't as easily get along with Protestants in the Middle East, but they would generally, there'd be many places where Catholics and Orthodox, whatever their persuasion in the Middle East, would recognize each other as apostolic Christians. Eastern Christians would readily identify, and either even examples of Catholic Orthodox clergy concelebrating the Eucharist, discrete kind of way. They're not supposed to, but they do it anyway, kind of thing. You know, like Syriac Catholic, Syriac Orthodox, Melkite, Antiochian, this kind of thing. Certainly celebrating baptisms, weddings, funerals, things like that. So on the ground, there's often a much richer sense of unity than sort of a bare reading of history would provide. And it should be mentioned that there's these examples of things that confound easy categorizations of these differences, like Isaac the Syrian. He's a very important ascetical figure. I think he's the 9th century. He lives after the, is he 9th? No, shoot, when is he? I can't remember his dates right now. Lives after the Council of Chalcedon. He's an Assyrian. He's a Nestorian Christian who's venerated as a saint by all Oriental Orthodox and by the Byzantines. Historian, technically, but his holiness was so great that everyone felt that you should venerate him and read his writings and practice his counsels of prayer. And oh yeah, he's an historian, but like it wasn't his fault probably, you know, like he doesn't. So you get this kind of, the water flows in different ways. Like on the one hand, you differences ecclesiologically and jurisdiction and in terms of even doctrine. Meanwhile, people are praying the same liturgy and exchanging hymns and prayers, right?
Yeah. Well, part of what I'm thinking while I'm asking that is, even in Toronto, I happen to live in the East End at one point and the West End in the other point. And both times it was on the one was on the Danforth and the other was Bloor West. So you get the Danforth, which is more the Greek Catholics more congregated together, and that's what was settled there. That's completely one side of the city. Yeah. And you can still drive it maybe in 20 minutes if you're lucky on the 401, but that's a long way to go to get to the other side of the Humber River. Yeah. And end up in Bloor West and end up with more, it's still more the Slavic, Polish, Russian, Hungarian, that type of stuff. Catholics being over there, that they're complete opposite ends of the city. They're not they didn't even mixed together within Toronto when it was being settled for whatever particular reason, whether it's timing or something like that. So that's part of what I'm thinking. And
Yuri will tell you that in Montreal, sometimes the Catholic and Orthodox churches, Ukrainian, are right across the street from me. Yes. Which I think in Toronto, there's some examples of that too. Like sometimes the closer you are, the more you fight about the few things that you don't have in common, and the more, the more toxic those few differences can be, you see? Right. So there is a lot of sociology in this too, that, I mean, it's to some extent, will take us too far afield, but, and I'm not even an expert, but, you know, sociologist religion could sort of go to town on some of these and how that they are shaped by external pressures, right? So when you are persecuted, you tend to seek the commonality of people with whom, if you weren't persecuted, you would have the luxury of like arguing with them. But since you don't, since like the Middle Eastern Christians, we all have to deal with these Muslims, well, we better like put aside our differences. But in a place like Ukraine, where they didn't have Islam, everyone was Christian except Jews, right? Then you could argue about what kind of Christian you are. But again, under communism, people were persecuted under communism. There was often a great degree of intercommunion in concentration camps, right? Or work camps, because at that point, when you're persecuted by atheists, you're a Christian, praise the Lord. Like what kind of, doesn't matter, right? There's ecumenism of blood, right? An ecumenism of the trenches. So there's always the story is always more complex, but for our own sanity, we kind of have to try to lay it out in these broad heaps. Okay, just almost to wrap up here for tonight. The Byzantine missions after the Great Schism, so with Rome, that is, they already had the schisms, as I explained, in the 5th century with the Assyrian Church and the Oriental Orthodox. So we basically have big divisions every 500 years or so. We've got some in the 5th century, we've got 11th century and thereafter, and then in the 16th century, particularly in the West. That means we're due for another one after this pandemic. I don't know. So we have the evangelization of the Slavic world, predominantly by the Byzantines, and the emergence of a whole series of nation-state churches right? Churches that are independent but part of these, but part of the Orthodox Federation. The church is seen and functions as bearing the national identity, and that is a dynamic which one of my favorite theologians, Aidan Nichols, describes as one where the church is shown to be ecclesia in gentibus rather than ecclesia ex gentibus, the church in the nations rather than the church taken out of the nations. And the difference is there's between, in the West tends to think of, you're Polish Catholic, you're Italian, you're Polish, you're Irish, but we're all Roman Catholic, right? And historically, the Latin Rite unified all these different people, languages. In Byzantium, it was like that. Everybody used Greek originally, who used the Byzantine liturgy, whether they're in Antioch or Alexandria or Constantinople. But over time, the principle of enculturation leads to people using Serbian, Romanian, or Georgian, or what have is, Slavonic, and then eventually Ukrainian, and so forth. So the emphasis is back on the centripetal, fleeing the center, right? Stressing the enculturation. So there's these ebbing and this flowing of sort of whether you privilege that which brings you, that makes you like others and helps you sort of transcend your particularity, or you kind of pull back into, lean back into the particularity and stress the distinctiveness. And many Eastern Catholics find this what makes them uncomfortable, because they don't want to be seen, whether in conversations with family members or friends, to be saying our church is better, right? So, but they also can't say our church is true and yours is false, because they don't believe that. So then how do you speak, how do you rationalize the our, yours, right? Do you say ours is ours just because it's ours and yours is yours because it's yours? Well, that's a tautology, but why should it be ours? Why should it be yours? Ours is ours because we serve pierogies after liturgy and you serve, okay, no, that's not really a good reason. Ours is ours because our liturgy is in Ukrainian and yours is in Latin, except that the Latin liturgy can be served in Ukrainian, and now it is. There are Roman Catholics in Ukraine who have the Roman Mass in Ukrainian. Okay, ours is ours because we're priests. Okay, you see, like we could cut you. So people come up with, but we're not saying that it's bad to have celibate priests, because we have those too, and you do too, and we think it's great that you do, and we even have some. We have a lot of those too, and all our bishops celibate, so we're good, right? See, so there's this kind of this attempt to say, it's a collective psychology that tries to say, how do I fit? How does particularity fit within this mosaic in such a way that it enhances it, without kind of coming across in any way as triumphalist or dominating, or somehow saying that you have to now be like me. It's really a question of otherness. It's a philosophical question, a psychological, a sociological question, a theological question. Christianity has never been able to figure out, how do you balance the one and the many? The ancient Greeks understood this is a problem. How do one and the many relate? And the church has said, yeah, we're working on that. Jesus, God and man, Mary, Virgin and Mother, the Trinity, 3 in 1, the church, 1 in many. In each of this, marriage, 2 but 1, right? In each of these instances, we see this dynamic of the one and the many being, people find the proper balance. So over time, we get, as we've already said, many portions of many Orthodox churches coming into union for all sorts of reasons. Today there's 23, and they're all different, and they all have their own story. They will represent these different churches that we will be studying, their Orthodox counterparts, for the remainder of our time together. So that's a bit of a overview of the history. Obviously, it's necessarily brief, and I've painted in very broad strokes. Almost anything and everything I've said could be qualified. It would be qualified by, if we were to sort of just focus in on that. But I just wanted you to have a sort of a sense of the topography, so that as we get into the particularity of the different traditions, beginning with the Coptic Church tomorrow, you have some sense of where this church is located vis-a-vis all those. Any closing questions or comments? And again, I'm happy to stick around afterwards after we conclude in prayer in a few moments.
Just a technical comment. I'm wondering if people can mute their microphones when not speaking, simply because I'm finding that there must be multiple unmuted mics, and as people breathe, Brian's voice actually recedes and it becomes difficult to hear. So just a point of technical.
The one and the many. There you go. Joshua wants to privilege the one over the many, guys, but it's no slight on you, your personhood, okay? Just any other comments or questions?
Just the chat boxes. There's some active chatting going on.
Oh, okay.
About the fourth Rome. We need you to give a whole lecture on that.
The fourth Rome. Is there a fourth one? I didn't know. I didn't know about that one.
We were just joking. We joked about making Belleville the fourth Rome.
Oh, yeah, oh yes. There's a fourth Rome upstate New York. Very good. Yeah.
There is a St. Michael's in Belleville.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, so I think we'll end for tonight. And is there somebody else who'd like to sing? Because my voice is always tired of this. I'm really happy to have Yuri sing the Svetitsa again. For us, that's on the Gregorian calendar. It's the eve of Ascension. So maybe tomorrow night I'll sing the Ascension Troparion before class. But if somebody else has something that they want to chant a prayer, I don't want to exclude even, we were happy to take Anglican hymns, Joshua. If you have, maybe tomorrow we should sing Hail the Day That Sees Him Rise, great Wesleyan hymnographer, great Wesley brothers hymnographers. But unless there's other takers, let's have Subdeacon Yuri sing The Angel Cried again for us, please.
Ангел сповіщав благодатній, чистая діво, радуйся, і знову кажу, радуйся, твій син воскрес тридневний з гробу, і мертвих возвигнув він. Люди, веселітеся, світися, світися, новий Єрусалиме, слава Господня на тобі воссіяла. Радій нині, веселися, Сіоне, а ти чиста, як красуєшся, Богородице, востанням рождення Твого.
Christ is risen.
Indeed, he is risen.
Thank you, everyone, for your attention.
Thank you, Brian.
I was happy to stick around now and just say tomorrow to begin the class, we'll just invite you, less formal discussion, to bring any question you had from the Bradshaw and Johnson comment or question, and I'd be happy to, we'll start off with, take some time to discuss that in an informal way, okay? Because I want to make sure people are able to make sense of the readings.
I had a question already.
If, feel free to log off. I'll still stick around for 5-10 minutes for anyone who wants to talk about anything else. Yes, please, Juliana.
Oh, just they started going off on the soft areas, and I got stuck. I don't know what they mean by soft.
The soft areas are the areas, just like in the liturgy, there are spots where you can, there's spots where you have to do things, say certain things. And there's other spots where there's like a natural pause or break where you can stuff something in without anybody really knowing. So the soft areas, there's 3 of them really, especially 3 of them. But it's when something's happening and you might need it to take a bit longer than it's taking. So then you think you maybe put something else in. So the beginning of liturgy, it's supposed to start at 11 o'clock, but Father's late, so let's sing something. Heck, we really like singing this. Let's sing it next week, even if you start on time. We'll sing it at 10:55. Or like sing a bunch of things. So no, keep being late. We're gonna sing a bunch of stuff beforehand, okay? So at the beginning, we stuff stuff. Then you think after liturgy, we want to give thanks for communion. We don't want to leave. I mean, maybe there's donuts, but the kids can go. But those who want to stay, we want to sing something. Maybe we want to sing more than one thing. So we start adding stuff at the end of the service, not just Divine Liturgy, other services too. And then sometimes in the middle, at communion, might take a long time. So you might sing something and then something else. So you begin to add things, and then people get used to it. And eventually people think that's the thing you have to sing at that time, right? So, so the soft points of the liturgy, the points that admit things to be inserted in a way that wouldn't disrupt the logic. If in the middle of the Eucharistic prayer, as the priest is saying, "Take, eat, this is my body," all of a sudden the cantor were to then sing a hymn, like one of our hymns is like, "Take ye the body of Christ," the Eucharistic hymn. If you were to say, "Take ye the body of Christ," instead of saying "Amen," all of a sudden people are like, "What are you doing? That's not what you say then," right? That is not a soft spot. You have to say "Amen," the cantor, the people, the choir, because that's what is prescribed by the script. The time of communion is a time where you could have it done in silence, or you could have one person chanting a psalm, or you could sing a hymn. There's a whole variety of things that could happen. So it allows, it's soft in the sense that it admits new content. And when we look at the evolution of the liturgies, that's exactly what's happened. All these hymns that Ukrainians like to sing, which influenced originally by Polish hymn singing, chorales, which come really from Protestantism actually, they end up, when they come into our liturgy, they come in at the beginning at communion and at the end. Nobody thinks of putting them instead of the Prokeimenon or in something like that. But you'll notice it ends up having a knockoff effect. So another soft spot technically is the transfer of the gifts. When the priests bring the gifts and we sing, "Let us who mystically represent the cherubim." But you'll notice that people in Ukrainian churches, they'd like to sing that text to a hymn tune. There are chant tunes, but people like to take popular hymns and put that text to the tune because it then gives a different feeling of mood or of season and so forth. So soft spots are also times where things can be contracted. Originally, there were very long chants for that, "Let us who mystically represent the cherubim." And the Znameni chants, some of them take 20, 25 minutes to sing just that text because the monasteries are not in a rush, number one. And number two, when you're preparing and transferring real bread, right, that's been properly prepared to the proscomedia rather than like pre-cuts or something, all of this in a big chalice and stuff, it takes time, right, to do these things properly. So the chants would be longer and the music was longer, and they would have psalm verses sometimes in between and then repeat the refrain. And the soft spots are also where you can add repetitions or take away repetitions. And that's exactly what happens, right? At communion, if there's hardly any people for communion, you might just sing something once, but if there's lots of people, you might sing it many, many times. So in all of the literature.
Yeah, thank you very much. I was really confused about that. I just want to know, did anybody ever thought about like taking all the soft spots out and see what you get?
So what you get is something like the following. You don't get people you can't really take out the communion time, but what you can do is say that you can prescribe what should be done. So for example, hymn singing is not done in the Russian church, for example. Like if they do it in the home, maybe if they do it at all, but they don't do that in church because they don't say that. They say those aren't canonical texts. So they'll say communion, you can only sing Psalm 33 or the appointed communion chant, or maybe read communion prayers by the fathers, something like that. But you can't just go sing any hymn that you happen to like, because every text that should be prayed out loud in church should be approved in some way, and they don't consider those hymns to sort of have that kind of pedigree. And so even before or after the liturgy, you keep silence, or one person is reading prayers before communion or something like that, something that has an older, stamp of approval rather than some new composition. Whereas in Ukrainian churches, people are still writing hymns, right? So you'll get, you could write a hymn, Juliana, and probably take it to St. Demetrius and say, "Hey, I got this hymn." And if they don't see anything heretical, they'll say, "Well, sure, we'll sing that at communion or before or after liturgy." But if you say, "Yeah, I've got this thing I want to sing instead of the Holy God, we're going to sing some new thing." Well, they're like, "Well, no, we can't do that." You see? So there's a sense, each tradition has a certain kind of rigidity, like a spinal cord. It can, but only so far before it breaks.
Yeah, I'm kind of leaning towards more like sifting out everything to the essential. You know how you've got those charts and I lined everything up, and I thought, well,
why don't you, everything in between you can cut out as inessential, or sorry, bad word, soft spot. And what do you have that's like pure essence? And
Ooh, okay. So you are going to like reading Taft's article, Mass Without the Consecration.
okay,
This
I'll just jump
comes
to
up
that.
because there were people, there were scholastic, you could fit really on the medieval Latin West, there were scholastic theologians who said exactly that. What is the essence of the Mass? How much can we take out? And you get these ridiculous scenarios like, if a building's burning down and you've gotten to X point in the liturgy, was the Eucharist consecrated or not? And like, if the priest has only said, take, eat, this is my body, but he hasn't said, take, drink, this is my blood, is the consecration accomplished? Do you have to take the Eucharist out with you if you can, or, but you take the bread, but not the wine, because it's, so you get people asking these kinds of questions. In the West, they kind of settle on the idea that as long as the priest has the intention to consecrate and says, take, eat, this is my body, that's kind of the essence of the Mass, is the words of institution. The thing that throws the monkey into the wrench is that the anaphora vadae in Mari, which is used by the Assyrians in the East, has no words of institution. They believe it's the body and blood of Christ. They refer to the body and blood all over the place, but they never quote Jesus's words. And then you get who say, no, it's the invocation of the Holy Spirit. But there's a brilliant Russian Orthodox theologian, Michel Zheltov, who then writes an article showing that in Byzantine history, some people thought it happened at the proskynesis, preparation before the liturgy. Some people thought it happened at the words of institution. Some people thought it happened at the invocation of the Holy Spirit. Some people thought it happened when you added the hot water to the chalice before communion, which is kind of like the moment of where the flesh becomes warm and living. So the lives of the saints, you get people like seeing visions or angels of Jesus at different times and confirming to them. So it's really wonderfully messy in the sense that if you're asking what is the essence of the Eucharist, one level a good question, one level it's not a good question, because of course you can boil down, you could make steak in a laboratory and say this is the essence of steak in this pill or something like that. But it's not the same as barbecuing a steak, right? Like someone say, I've got all the essential nutrients of a steak in this capsule. You'd say, yeah, but this is not the experience of eating is missing, right? A barbecuing of the smoke or whatever. So in the liturgy, if you start by asking how much can we pare off, you may end up cutting the thing down in such a way that you've somehow lost something without realizing it, right? That the forest that you take away, how many trees you have to take away before you don't have a forest isn't clear. Could take one more, yeah, but by the end you just have like a few trees and like that's not a forest. And so some critique of the liturgical reforms in the West would be along these lines, like, well, it's Sacrosanctum Concilium, Second Vatican Council said, yeah, we got to get rid of useless repetitions. Okay, who decides what's useless? Is repetition always useless, or can there be good repetition? So they took the ninefold Kyrie and they made it sixfold. Instead of Kyrie eleison, Kyrie eleison, Kyrie eleison, Christe, 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 Kyrie, 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 which all the music fits that, right? They made it Kyrie, Kyrie, Christe, Christe, Kyrie, Kyrie. So they went from 9 to 6. There's still repetition. It's not really clear what was gained by that, because you basically screwed up the music, all the settings that you had. You still have repetition. You've basically saved how many seconds? Is this somehow saving a few seconds is important, especially if you recite it? Oh, but somebody's trying to say, well, let's get down to the essence of the Kyrie. Well, the essence of the Kyrie, if you get around a little bit, you realize that Byzantines will sing it 3 times, 12 times, 40 times, and then on the Feast of the Exaltation of the Cross, 100 times, which we then do several times. Right? So the idea is you cannot get to the essence of the Kyrie is that you stand for the rest of eternity and say, Lord, have mercy, because there's nothing else to say, right? That is the only thing that a human being needs to say in the presence of God is, Lord, have mercy, right? So in that sense, it's essential, it becomes rather arbitrary. And so one has to be very careful about taking, it's like you start knocking down walls when you're renovating it. We don't really need this wall. We don't really need this door. And all of a sudden the whole building collapses. It may be that you don't need that wall. Certainly there are things that are not necessary. They're strictly ornamental. But one has to be very, very careful about presuming that there won't be sort of a domino effect when you start that kind of renovation.
I've had a question for a while, but it's kind of a can of worms, so I didn't want to interrupt the lecture with it.
As you can see, Patrick, I have no problem with excursus.
Yeah. Well, I'll duly note it. I'll keep that in mind. But it's a big question that probably we could be talking about for years. But it's important to me personally, in my discovery of these traditions and discernment of where I belong in them. It's important to me to get clear on what it means theologically to be not theologically, that is, not just as a matter of confession, but as a matter of theological reality, to be in communion with Rome, but not be a Roman Catholic. You know what I mean? Do you understand my question?
Well, we Eastern Catholics know exactly what you mean, man.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we are.
But
Exactly.
I don't just mean a matter of the propriety of what you, the propriety of your confessions or what canons or what, whatever you confess or profess. I mean, like, what's the reality here? What does that mean? And I don't expect you to be able to give me.
I mean, that's a great question, and it's something, for example, to bring the matter a bit closer, say, to home for some people, say like Joshua. He was asking about the ordinariate, and this was a huge part of, and is part of the ongoing, discernment. Their question had much more force because the Anglicans who wanted to come into communion with Rome they're coming from a church that was originally Latin Catholic, right? Before the Anglicans were Anglican, they were Latin Catholic. Before Ukrainians were Ukrainian Catholic, they were still Byzantine Christians, right? They've never been Latin Christians. So there you even there, and under Pope Benedict, of course, Anglicanum Cedibus, they had to thrash this out. Well, they said there's two things going on. There's patrimony and there's primacy. Patrimony is everything that's distinctive about being Anglican. A lot of that is good. Some of it is problematic, like Cranmer didn't believe in the real presence, and he didn't believe in a sacrificing priesthood, and he took out prayers for the dead, and didn't believe in veneration of Mary and saints, and so on. So part of the patrimony, but everything he said beautifully, poetically. The Book of Common Prayer is a masterpiece, right? But some of its theology is problematic. So the Anglicans are coming into full communion and say, well, how do we preserve everything that's good and true and beautiful in our tradition and not lose that, but also have the things rectified by reference to the primacy, right, the Pope of Rome, and that are either deficiencies that need to be remedied or things that are twisted or that need to be straightened out. And there's a lot of back and forth on that. Nobody suggested, well, not anybody suggested, wasn't really listened to. Well, you guys are originally Roman Catholic, so you just have to go back to being Roman Catholic because that's what you were prior to the 16th century. Everyone understood that the 5 centuries in between were very fertile, and a very rich kind of Christian life has been theology and pastoral experience and hymns and chant and also and choral traditions has been characteristic of Anglicanism, but missionary work, all sorts of things, right? So you don't want to lose all that. But how do you bring that in such a way that there's space for the things that you may have been missing out on, right? And also, more poignantly, how do you bring that in if some of those things that you're attached to have intrinsic problems? And that is not at all an easy question, even for people, but it's harder the closer you are, as it were, to the center. The Latin Church itself has a long experience with variety, like the Carthusians and the Dominicans and the Carmelites and the Franciscans and the Benedictines, to speak about the monastic orders, have had their own forms of worship, certainly their own forms of spirituality, and these forms of spirituality are legion in the West. It's all just, all sorts of schools of spirituality and mystical traditions, and you could, in fact, one way of thinking about the Protestant Reformation is one could think that people like Luther and Calvin, if circumstances were propitious, could have been the kind of people who would found a new school of spirituality or a new religious order without needing to break communion, right? But that's not happened. But many of the people who stayed within the church were the kind of people who had circumstances been otherwise could have easily founded their own churches. Like the same kind of charisma and individuality, Ignatius of Loyola, for example, he wants to do something really quite new. And had the church not found a way to keep the Jesuits on side, and actually over their history, sometimes they weren't on side, then the Jesuits could have just hived off and become their own, religion or something. So denomination, at any rate. So I think, that's just like, yeah, it's a massive question. It's a kind of question that is a good heuristic for reading church history, but also for the history of worship in particular. And I think the Eastern Catholic churches are basically like the laboratory where these things get experimented with. We don't generally, I think, at least today, have much of a sense of triumphalism. Like, we don't go to say to Orthodox brethren, oh my gosh, like, what's with you people? Why don't you get with the program and become in communion with Rome? We understand there's lots of problems with that. We also think that somebody has to test those waters. In other words, someone has to explore what does it mean to have this diversity within the household, if that's what the church once was, and if that's what Christ wants the church to be. Now, if you say that's not what Christ wants the church to be, then you don't have that problem. And if you say that's what the church was, but it didn't need to stay that way, then you don't have that problem. But if you say that's the way the church was, historical honesty, if that's what Christ wants, I think theological honesty, then someone has to get their hands dirty and figure that out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I guess the Augustinian notion of the church invisible is the idea that the church exists whether I'm here to belong in it or not. You know what I mean? Yep. Is very, very important to me. I guess there's a kind of, what do I want to say? But part of my attraction to Christianity and my desire to be involved in it in an abiding and lifelong way, within that there's a streak of I guess metaphysical self-denial, or like metaphysical, like we'll go with metaphysical self-denial. The idea that paradox, like I don't really matter, like, and whenever I meditate on that idea, together with the notion of the church invisible, the notion that, the church is doing what it's doing metaphysically, with or without me, I actually feel very encouraged. It's not a nihilistic thing for me.
Yeah.
Or if it is, it's transitionally nihilistic, I guess. I'm talking, in a way, I'm talking in circles, but I hope I'm perambulating some intelligible center.
You could think, if you extrapolate from your experience and think about the church as a corporate person,
yeah,
you could make the same claim. The church is ultimately the church, even if we didn't have the Byzantine Rite anymore, we didn't have the Latin Rite anymore. We don't need this particular particularity, right? Like, we don't need zebras and lions to have a savanna. Right. There, and they make it wonderful, right? And now that we know that there are zebras and lions, it'd be a pity to not have them. But the church, the savanna doesn't depend on those particular species. The church doesn't depend on the particular species that we actually have, Armenians, Syro-Malabar, and so forth. But from another, logically speaking, metaphysically speaking, but empirically, it does depend on it, in the sense that the universal is present to us in the particular. And so in that sense, each of these churches matters the way that every human matters. Like, the story of Scripture isn't just a story of the people of God, but it's the story of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Deborah, Naomi, Judith, and so forth, right? So in that sense, the God seems to allow very big things to depend on very small things, and abstract truths to become present in the world through particular words, moments, actions, people, deeds. In that sense, all of these things matter. And our church is, one sense, provisional. Like, if all the Orthodox and Catholics were to, get in communion tomorrow, our leaders have said this. Our patriarchs, all our last 3-4 patriarchs of our church have said, if the Catholic Church could with the Eastern Orthodox, we would not need to exist as a separate body. And our patriarch said, I would abdicate, and we would all go under the, or now would be the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, presumably. So the head of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine under Constantinople. We would cease to exist because our existence is provisional. In that sense, we only exist, Eastern Catholics that is, to point to a reality which, were it to be fully manifest, would not require us to exist anymore. And
I've
yet
heard you
on the
say
other-
that before in other lectures. Like I familiarized myself with some of your work before this course, and I've heard you say that before, and it was really moving to me. It struck to something something essential to how I understand myself as getting involved with Christianity. So I'm trying to puzzle that out.
Yeah. Well, you're asking all the right questions, man. Really, yeah. And I mean, it's yeah. I mean, hopefully this course in particular may shed some light on it. But you're asking questions that really will require you to invest in your study of history or study of mathematics, dogmatic theology. You really want to explore all the corners of the garden, kind of thing, to get into to find it. All of this topic, yeah. Great, Patrick. Well, great to have you. Yeah.
Well, sir, I'm sure we'll talk much more.
Yeah. Okay. Good. We'll see you. Where are you located again? In Toronto, right?
Yeah, I'm on the North York Scarborough border. I'm at Victoria Park in Lawrence. I'm right around the corner from where the Syro-Malabar mission is now.
Oh, is that so? Yeah. I met the bishop recently. Who's newly arrived.
Yes.
The Institute, and we had a wonderful event where there was the Ukrainian Catholic bishop, the Chaldean Catholic bishop, and the Syro-Malabar all together. And he was interested in our work, and maybe we will increase our, intensify our relationship with them in the future. When I may be in Toronto in the next few weeks, when I didn't think that COVID was going to be lasting this long, I left. I didn't think COVID would last as long as it seemed to be lasting. I left my books. Well, all of my books are basically in Toronto. I only brought a handful of things, and I'm going to need more to get through the summer and fall. So I'm going to make a trip down to pick up some books. But we can maybe go for a beer or something like that in June if you're around, or July.
Assuming anyone can go for a beer.
Yeah, right. I think we're allowed. I think we can parks now and like get, because of Doug Ford, we're allowed to drink in parks, aren't we? So, or something like that.
Maybe we'll do like a 15-year-old thing, and we'll like put cans of beer in paper bags and.
Yes, yeah, you're right. Yeah,
okay.
Okay, we'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, okay, bye-bye.